Well, many years ago, I was comparing two very extreme opposites. And these are two different opposites in regards to ships. One was the USS Enterprise, and one was the Oasis of the Sea. Now, just to be clear, I was not evaluating for purchase. The USS Enterprise was built for about $450 million in 1960. There's a picture of it. The Oasis of the Sea was built for approximately $1.4 billion in 2006. I did buy a dinghy. It was about $79, but it was a better cost per passenger ratio. These are two of the largest ships in the world, and that's what I was comparing. They're also two very different ships. The USS Enterprise is approximately 340 meters long. It's the longest Navy vessel in the world, and it has approximately 4,600 service members on it at any given time. The Oasis of the Sea is a little bit longer at 360 meters, give or take, and it holds about 5,400 passengers. It's the largest passenger ship ever built. Some of the amenities on this ship include zip lining, skating. There's a central park area, 25 different dining options, pools, sports zones. There's 2 rock climbing walls within it. It's a massive ship. They're both very large, but they were created for very different purposes. See, the USS Enterprise, it has 4,600 service members on it, and each and every one of them have a specific task and purpose, a role. In order for this ship to be used for the reason it was created and intended, each and every person needs to carry out their task. If someone doesn't do their job, then it may limit its ability to function in the way that it was created. Whereas the Oasis of the Sea, a large ship as well, it was created for luxury, for people sitting back and enjoying being waited on hand and foot. I've never been on a cruise, but I've heard that the crew on the cruise, their purpose is to meet the needs of everybody that's on there and make sure that they can do as little as possible and enjoy themselves. And I believe that this represents 2 different attitudes that we can bring when we come to church. We can join the mission, using our gifts, abilities, our talents, and our resources to further the kingdom of heaven, or we can sit back and be spectators, expecting the church to serve me or to meet my needs, entertain me. I'm a firm believer that God has, in his wisdom and in his providence, has equipped each local church with all the people, the right giftings, the right abilities, the right resources to accomplish all that he's asking that local church to be a part of and to do. But he leaves the choice up to us. We can either be obedient and use our gifts, resources, talents, and abilities to further the kingdom, to be on mission, or we can sit back and think that the church is there to meet our needs. Today we're going to look at an attitude that Jesus represented in many different ways throughout scriptures and allow his word to speak to our hearts and to our lives so that we can live for him. We're going to be looking at the story of Jesus washing his disciples' feet, which can be found on page 1066 in your church Bibles. It's John 13, verses 1 to 17. This morning I'm going to be reading from the New Living Translation. You can follow along, or you can listen to the word of the Lord. John 13, and to begin we're going to read the first 3 verses. So verses 1 to 3 of John 13. The word of the Lord says this. Before the Passover celebration, Jesus knew that his hour had come to leave this world and return to his Father. He now showed the disciples the full extent of his love. It was time for supper, and the devil had already enticed Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to carry out his plan to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything and that he'd come from God and would return to God. So this is the background. This is the motive of why Jesus does this task. And there's 2 great truths that we learn in these first 3 verses. The first one is we learn the heart behind why Jesus washed their feet. And that was based on a heart of love. The end of verse 1 says this. He now showed the disciples the full extent of his love. Whereas the ESV says, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. For Jesus, everything he did, all contact he had with his disciples was based on love. The upper room was a time where Jesus made his love known very clearly. First, he washed his disciples' feet, And secondly, a few verses later in John chapter 13, we read in verse 34 and 35, Jesus says this, "So now I am giving you a new commandment. Love each other, just as I have loved you. You should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples." Jesus demonstrated his love for his disciples by serving them, by washing their feet. And this demonstration was done because of his love. There are many stories within history where we read or we hear about how someone pays somebody's debt. But there's no greater example than Jesus. Jesus, who was God, came and lived on the earth, served the creation that he created, and ultimately paid the price of death that is due to all mankind because of their rebellion towards him, the Creator, the one true God. He showed his love to the very end. The next day, Jesus was to be rejected, crucified, and buried. He was demonstrating his love and servant heart by washing his disciples' feet, the greatest demonstration of his love. Jesus also washes the feet of Judas Iscariot, the betrayer, washing his feet and serving him. The second thing we learn here is the motives behind service is that status and authority are not an excuse not to serve. Verse 3 says this, "Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything, and that he had come from God and would return to God." I can think of very specific people that I used to have in my life that had authority and used that authority not to serve, to not get things done. And I can remember having conversations with them where they were confused as to why other people weren't stepping up and serving and accomplishing different things that he was asking of them, but he wouldn't serve. And because of his lack of service, it caused a lack of service in those that he was trying to lead. If anyone had a reason to not accept the position of the least, it was Jesus. He had authority over everything. And the reason why I say the position of the least is because of this. The way this custom used to work in Jesus' day was the individual who was the least of them in that setting, in that situation, would take the towel and wash the feet of everybody else. Oftentimes it was a servant. Sometimes, however, the host, if they didn't have a servant, the host would wash the feet of his guests. Or the first few people that arrived, they washed the feet of those that came later on. Our family, we like to spend a lot of time in the outdoors. We like to go camping. And when I go camping, I typically wear flip-flops the entire time. And as we talked about a few moments ago, one thing that happens when you're camping, it's not pavement everywhere. Sometimes there's a little bit, but your feet get pretty dirty. And I can remember even just recently coming back, and my feet were so dirty, it didn't take one shower to actually clean them. And I hope this isn't just my case, but it took a couple showers to actually get the dirt off of my feet. Just yesterday, I was at the Wings Over Springbank Air Show, and it was in a farmer's field. I was there for a couple hours. I got home, my feet were dirty. They were visibly dirty, again in flip-flops. And this gives me insight into why this custom was practiced. You see, the disciples, they didn't have socks and closed-toe footwear. They wore sandals. Their feet were exposed. They're walking on dirt roads. They're walking through mud and muck, and it doesn't take long for your feet to get dirty. So as a result, the custom was to wash the people's feet when they came to your home. It was a custom to provide water to wash the feet, and a servant to wash, or the host that would themselves. And in a sense, this upper room meeting that Jesus and his disciples were a part of, it was a closed event. They weren't going to somebody's house. It was them coming together. They borrowed somebody's room, and they were meeting together to share the Passover. And I think what we see in this passage is a bit of a pecking order starts to be established. Who would be willing to stand up and say that they are the lesser? Who would stand up and wash the feet of the rest of their disciples and of Jesus? Wherever we go in culture, there seems to be a pecking order established. It's shown in where people sit. Who will yield to somebody else when you're walking towards each other? Who will go through a door first? Who is quick to help when a job needs to get done? And who sits back and waits? We see things like this through all aspects of society. And Jesus was abolishing the pecking order. He was not trying to do away with authority or leadership. That's something you can't do away with. But he was trying to abolish the pecking order. And we see time and time again that Jesus would come up against cultural norms of that pecking order of who he associated with and where he would go. I'm really involved with our denominational's Camp Camisol. I've been volunteering out there for many years. I used to be part of a high school week, and I now help out with junior high. And with the high school week, one of the things that we did each and every year was we called it kind of a trials day, where we'd experiment with different components and trying to get people to accomplish tasks. So some of those tasks were we'd have different flags, and you try to get down a shale mountain face without touching the flags, without touching the ground, and you had to be on certain sides of the flags based on the color. Other things that we've done is we'll take a 2x2 sheet of plywood. It's 18 inches off the ground, and you have to see how many of your team you can fit onto that little 2x2 sheet of plywood. Teams would range from about 18 to 20 people. We also have a 10-foot wall. You have to get your team over top of the wall without going around it. All you can do is, and there were guidelines for that. We had a 50-gallon drum that we drill holes in, and you have to see how high you can get the water level. And the interesting thing that we'd see each and every time we did this is a pecking order would be established. There would be somebody who usually had the right way of accomplishing it, but wasn't listened to by the group, and somebody who had no idea what they were doing, and they would waste their time trying to do this task based on bad information. And sometimes the person with the right way would finally get heard enough that they would be able to get their way done and they'd be able to accomplish the task. Sometimes they weren't. It was interesting to see how quickly that pecking order would be established when they'd arrive. A group of people, some would know each other, some would not. Jesus said in Matthew 20, verse 25 and 28 to 28, "But Jesus called them together and said, 'You know that the rulers in this world lord it over their people and officials, flaunt their authority over those under them. But among you it will be different. Whoever wants to be the leader among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you must become your slave. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others, and to give his life as a ransom for many.'" Jesus had authority, but his authority wasn't found in position or title, but in a towel, in the way that he served all of humanity. The motive was established. Jesus came to be a servant to all of humanity out of the love that he has for each and every one of us. And now we look at some of the ways that Jesus demonstrated his servant heart to his disciples by washing his feet. We're going to continue on reading verses 4 to 12a, and it says this. "So he got up from the table, took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, and poured water into a basin. Then he began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel he had around him. When he came to Simon Peter, Peter said to him, Lord, why are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You don't understand now why I'm doing it. Someday you will." "No," Peter protested, "you will never wash my feet." Jesus replied, "But if I don't wash you, you won't belong to me." Simon Peter exclaimed, "Then wash my hands and head as well, Lord, not just my feet." And Jesus replied, "A person who has bathed all over does not need to wash except for his feet to be entirely clean. And you are clean, but that isn't true of everyone here." For Jesus knew who would betray him, and that is what he meant when he said, "Not all of you are clean." After washing their feet, he put on his robe again and sat down. The disciples are with Jesus in the upper room, about to partake of the Passover feast. A conversation previously happened among the disciples, and we read about that in Luke 22, and an argument arose among them. They were arguing over who would be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, which is ironic based on what's going on here. Now, we don't know if this argument produced this situation of Jesus washing the feet of his disciples, but we do know that it was during the Last Supper, and the disciples were still trying to figure out their pecking order. Who would be more important? They had not yet grasped the fact that as Christians, we are to be people of the towel, that we are to serve those around us out of an attitude of love. So John tells us that Jesus got up from the table, he took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, poured water in a basin, and began to wash his disciples' feet. I can imagine at this time all the disciples replaying the argument that just happened amongst them about who was important and who would be greater as Jesus begins to humbly wash their feet. And I love Peter. He says oftentimes what everyone else is thinking or what everybody else is afraid to say. And when Jesus gets to Peter, he says, "You'll never wash my feet." He understood that in their culture, Jesus was taking the role of the least important, and Peter was adamant that he wasn't. Jesus responds by saying that those that have been cleaned don't need to be washed except for their feet. Kent Hughes comments on this, saying that Jesus' response and says, a justified believer, the disciples did not need a radical new cleansing, but rather a daily cleansing from the contaminating effects of sin. Jesus then finishes washing his disciples' feet, including Judas Iscariot, the one that would leave the table in a few minutes to betray him to his death. And I believe that this is important. Jesus didn't wait until Judas had left. Judas leaves almost right after this event. Jesus is demonstrating an attitude of service to everyone, not just to your friends, not just to those who treat you well, but service to all, even those who may hate you, who hurt you, those who betray us. Being people of the towel is an attitude of serving all of humanity each and every day. The foot washing doesn't take long, and Jesus had a very specific message that he was trying to communicate to his disciples. He didn't want them to miss it. We'll continue reading the end of verse 12 to the end of 17. It says this. Jesus says, "Do you understand what I was doing? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, because it is true. And since I, the Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash each other's feet. I have given you an example to follow. Do as I have done to you. How true it is that a servant is not greater than the master, nor the messengers are more important than the one who sends them. You know these things, now do them. That is the path of blessing." After Jesus concludes the act of washing his disciples' feet, he asks them if they understand what he was doing. Everything Jesus did was planned out and for a reason. Sometimes it was really clear, sometimes not so clear in the moment. And I think this specific act, he really wanted the disciples to get it, because the next day he was going to the cross, and he wanted to make sure that they were learning what it is that they needed to learn from him. So not waiting for an answer, Jesus explains, "You call me teacher and Lord, you call me greater than yourselves. Since I, who am greater, washed your feet, of you who are lesser, you ought to wash each other's feet." Jesus is using what's often referred to as affortiori. I had it before, I'm sorry. It's a Latin word, and it means with even stronger reason. And this applies to a situation in which if one thing is true, then it can be inferred that a second thing is even more certainly true. So if Jesus, who is greater, is washing the feet of his disciples, serving them, it is more certainly true that they who are lesser should also do the same. We go back to verse 3, and it says, Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything, and that he had come from God and would return to God. Jesus, who is fully God, came to earth, born of a virgin, lived on earth serving his creation, humanity. So how much more should we follow his example and be people of the towel? So what does this mean for us today? As we go through this series, we want a faith at home opportunity with every Sunday, every discipline that we talk about. And I love talking about the disciplines because there are some that should be established in every believer's heart and life. That is reading the scriptures, prayer, corporate worship, and I would say service. There are other ones that are unique to different individuals in the ways that you can connect with God. Some people are going to connect better in silence, in solitude, in submission, in all these different disciplines than others. But there are some that need to be a part of every believer's life, and this is one of them. Church leaders often talk about the 80-20 rule. And it says 20% of the people do 80% of the work, 20% of the people give 80% of the resources. This rule doesn't seem to only be true within churches, but business world talks about it, finance world talks about it. You can see people throughout many aspects of society talking about the 80-20 rule. I don't think that it is accurate for Harvest Hills, but I do believe that we have some opportunities for growth. I want you to imagine if everyone who called Harvest Hills Alliance Church home was committed to using their gifts, their abilities, their talents, and their resources for the glory of God through Harvest Hills. I get excited thinking about that. We see God at work in many ways, but if everybody was using their gifts, abilities, talents, and resources, how many more lives would we see forever changed? The victory that people would experience, that healing people would find, all for the glory of God. It would be incredible, and it would be amazing to be a part of that. The main reason I'm a huge advocate for service is because as you serve, a shift happens in your thinking. You go from trying to meet your own needs to meeting the needs of others. It is a countercultural way of thinking. It makes us more like Jesus. When I think back to when I got married, a good friend of mine who had tons of marital experience, about a year and a half, he gave me some great advice. And he said, if you want to learn how selfish you are, get married. I was already engaged, so I was about to learn that. And I didn't believe him, but he was correct. He had great wisdom. And then even more so, when you have kids, you learn, yeah, I still have a long way to go on this selfish scale. Human nature is to worry about yourself, to promote yourself, to try to get ahead. And I believe that one of the ways that you'll begin to do this, to not worry about everything, is by service. Jesus says in Matthew 6:25, do not worry about everyday life. Trust in your heavenly Father. Growing up, I had a great example of my parents. Both of them have given thousands of hours to church service, to ministry service, to organizations, community, government, friends, neighbors, people they don't know. I grew up with my parents living this life of service out, and it has created a desire for me to try to do the same. I'm not perfect in it. I miss many opportunities. But my desire is that God will allow me to see the world through his eyes so that I can be a reflection of him as I serve and love his creation and the world. So how do we start this in our own lives? I think it starts with a simple prayer each and every day, saying, Lord, give me the eyes to see the people and the world as you see it. There are opportunities each and every day for us to serve. Turn our eyes off of ourselves to see the world, seeing the opportunities to be the hands and feet of Jesus, to have a maximum outward impact in the lives of others, in our community, in our city, in our nation, and around the world. You need to know yourself as well. There are spiritual gifts that God has given us, and we need to use those for the glory of God. We also have talents and abilities. There are different types of gifts that are given. We read about them throughout Scripture. 1 Corinthians 12 is a great place to go. And we learn in some ways that there are service gifts. So some of those would include teaching, serving, leading, giving, helps, administration, hospitality. There are many other gifts that may be classified as the revelatory gifts. And they're equally important, but they have a different purpose within the church. They still offer a much-needed component for us to be the church that we were created to be. If you have one of these gifts, we need to grow in it. We need to use it for the glory of God. Everyone needs to know and be practicing in the spiritual gift that God has given to you. If you don't know what your spiritual gift is, email me, call me. I'd love to talk with you a little bit more about what it is and help you explore the way that God has created you and the gift that he's given to you by his Holy Spirit. All who have accepted Jesus Christ as their Lord have been given a gift for the glory of God. Besides these gifts, we also have talents, we have abilities, we have resources. And these can be used for God as well. A beautiful aspect of the church is that it requires all of us. There's really something for everyone, a way for everyone to get involved. If we just think about a typical Sunday morning here, we have ushers, we have tellers, we have greeters, we have people at the info desk, people making coffee, stacking chairs after the service, nursery helpers. We still have a great need for nursery helpers throughout the summer. We put up a board. We're looking for a few volunteers each day, a great opportunity for you to use some of the gifts, talents, and abilities that God has given to you. Throughout the majority of the year, we also have nursery, preschool, grade school, 56, youth, adult learning, and ESL. We also have a great new opportunity to create social media content, trying to get the gospel message out into the world in unique and creative ways. We're looking for people to help be content creators for that. If you'd like to be involved, please come talk to me. We're doing Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram right now, and we'd love to have you join us and be a part of that. We also have worship team, sound techs, media operators, camera operators. And right now we have a huge need within our media, our sound, and our camera operators. We need more people to step up to be a part of that And all you really need is you just need an interest. If you're interested in any of that component, we'll provide the training, we'll provide the support so that you can do that successfully, because we desperately need people to step up so that we can continue to be all that God is asking and has created us as a church to be. If you're interested in that, talk to Pastor Sherry, and she'll love to get you involved. As we spread out the load, everyone has a task. No single person should ever be overloaded. Getting involved in an organized ministry is great and is needed. All these ministries require people using their gifts and talents for the glory of God. Those are just ministries that go on a Sunday morning. There are many other throughout the week for opportunities for people to use their gifts and abilities for the glory of God. Pray and ask God how He'd have you be involved, how He'd have you use your talents and your resources here in the local church. Now, a word to parents. My challenge to you is to create a culture of service within your family. I think one of the greatest gifts that you can give to your children is trying to create a countercultural kids who are not just about being entertained, but are about serving others. I was out at Camp Camisol Wednesday night, and I was talking to a longtime family friend. He's volunteered 19 summers out at Camp Camisol, his wife 29, and his grandson was out there with him as well. He's doing his 3rd year. And he was telling me a story about how he first went to camp as a camper, and how he used to, whenever they go on family vacations, they'd always stay at the Hilton and experience the comforts of life on vacation. When he got back from Camp Camisol, his first words were, "Well, that's not the Hilton." Anybody who's been to any camp knows that's true. And they were wondering if he'd ever go back. And God touched his life out there, and he's been serving continually out there, and it's been a blessing to his grandfather to be able to watch his grandson no longer be concerned about just entertaining and being served himself, but to using his gifts and abilities for the glory of God. We try to do this with our kids as best we can as well. This past week, our fabulous chairs arrived. I'd first like to say a huge thanks to the management team who helped orchestrate this purchase. Our management team is a group of primarily volunteers using their gifts and abilities to benefit the church and bring glory to God. That team consists of Kevin Engel as chair, Scott Cahoon for tech, Dave Garrett for HR, Vern Gunther facilities, Steve Height for communications, and Michael Lowe on IT. It's been a great group of people who have blessed our church in incredible ways. And the chairs came on Wednesday. They weren't supposed to come to next week. We were surprised. And we were unloading the chairs. Carly came by with the boys, and it was a great opportunity for them to get involved and to help a great group of people of serving by bringing the chairs into the sanctuary. We had a great group. Matt Brooks was here, Scott Cahoon, Steve Height, Ed Keeler, Angela Lowe, Michael Lowe, Phil Morrow, Benjamin Ryan, Braden Ryan. Now, we don't normally bring attention to everybody who helps out in different ways, but I think as we're talking about service, we need to understand that different things go on throughout the church each and every day that require people using their gifts and abilities, and these people were just available. I came in Tuesday night and the floor hockey was on, and I said I could use some help tomorrow. Anybody willing? A bunch of hands shot up. We have a great culture here of service. Our boys were able to help out as well. They didn't the entire time. They're 5 and 7. But they enjoyed the opportunity of just taking the wrappings off the chair, cleaning up garbage, sometimes making a little bit more of a mess. We try to bring our boys along as best as we can in opportunities like that so that they can not only see us serving, but that they can begin to do that themselves. When I went out to Camp Camisol this past week, I went out to thank all the volunteers. And I brought the boys with me as well. When we deliver hampers, I bring the boys. When we took sandwiches to High River during the flood, I bring the boys. When we shovel our neighbor's walk, it's often their idea saying, we need to shovel their driveway. There are also many random opportunities that we have to bring our boys and allow them to see what service is all about. I've found it gets easier and easier every year as they're able to do more. And so far, they really enjoy it. My prayer is that they will become boys and men that are living a life of service. Boys and men of the towel. Our newest compassion child, we let the boys choose who that was. We engaged them in that process. We just helped them with the country because we want to be able to take them to that country to meet them so that they can have a broader global perspective about how and the responsibilities that they have as they grow up to the world. So parents, I would say start. Start involving your kids if you haven't already, and let them see you serving. Let them serve with you. It will grow your family closer together and help them to see the world through a lens that isn't focused on themselves. If all they see you do is work, they're going to learn that that's what's most important. If they also see you serving, they will learn the importance of that as well. I strongly believe that when you serve alongside with family and friends, and even people you don't know, your relationship will be strengthened, and it will be a great thing for the glory of God. Helping inside the church is important. I believe everyone should have a ministry within the local church. We also need to help outside the church, serve our community. The last 2 years, I had the opportunity of coaching U6 and U8 soccer with Travis Siemens. It's fun, and we get to meet a ton of people within the community, serving our neighbors at the same time. Getting involved outside the church is extremely important. The reality is that for many of us, the excuses are already starting to go within our mind. Well, that seems great, but I found a website this past week that talks about some of the top reasons that church leaders have heard for why people are not serving in the church. The number one, we can all guess it, is too busy. The second one is a bad past experience. Third one's too many pressures. They don't want to be tied down. Don't know what there is to do. Feel unqualified. Need fellowship myself. Never asked. Already served my time. Fear of failure. It's easy and it's natural for us to come up with excuses, but some of the busiest people I know give the most time. Not because it's easy, but it's become who they are. Serving changes us, changes our focus, and it makes us more like Jesus. Serving will in no way save us. It will not change our position before Christ, but it does draw us closer to God as we live our life for the glory of God. Seeing people and circumstances as an opportunity to use our gifts, abilities, and resources to further the kingdom of heaven. My prayer is that we would not be a church that is a cruise ship, but that we would be an aircraft carrier where everyone is aware of their role and carry it out to the best of their ability to the glory of God. Serving is not easy. It takes time. It often goes without recognition. But as Jesus, who had all authority given to him, served his disciples and all of humanity, he gave us the example and then the command, since I, the Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash each other's feet. Let us go and be people of the towel. Let's pray.